Good morning, everybody. Bright and early on a Saturday morning. Hopefully, many of you had fun on the square out in Madison last night. It's always a little hard on a morning after the first day of the conference, how many people will be able to show up at 8, 10 a.m., but glad to see you all here. I'm Erin Silva. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with an emphasis in organic agriculture and also with extension. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of the OGRAIN conference. We have a great day of programming for you today. We have some sessions in the morning, a first session here in this larger room, and then 2 additional breakout sessions like we did yesterday. So take the elevator or escalator 2 floors upstairs, and in those same rooms have some great presentations to wrap up the morning. And then coming together again for lunch, and then we are absolutely pleased to host a market update and buyer-seller mixer. So this is something that has been implemented at some of the conferences across the country through funding from the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. The Rodale Institute is leading these efforts. As we mentioned yesterday, one of the biggest challenges for organic farmers is establishing markets, particularly for crops beyond corn and soybeans. So this is really an effort to address that bottleneck and to provide access to expanded markets to be able to market the entire organic rotation. So super thrilled to have Argus Media back to be able to give us an update on organic grain markets, both domestic and imported, what we can see from a global perspective in terms of organic grain supplies, and then move into the mixer. We have some evaluations on the table with respect to organic grain markets. UW Extension is doing work to see what UW Extension can do to support organic farmers with respect to markets. So as you're sitting throughout the presentation this morning, if you want to grab one, fill that out, and the Division of Extension folks will come by and pick those up later. We also at OGRAIN love your feedback. Like I mentioned yesterday, this is really your conference, and we do this to support the organic industry. So we really want your feedback in terms of what about this event is working, what would you like to see in terms of topics and speakers. We really take those suggestions to heart. Also, other resources we can help to create to assist you, whether it be written resources, fact sheets, videos, other programming, particularly looking for feedback in terms of field days. What would you guys like to see in terms of field days? Do you want in-person field days, virtual field days? So Kelly, by the registration table, has a few copies of the evaluations, not the evaluations, but also some broader feedback. And we'll do a drawing, so if you finish those evaluations and that feedback, we are going to have a drawing for a free registration to the conference next year. So please give us a feedback. Also, happy to have feedback anytime to our email inboxes as well. So I am a little hesitant to mention that we don't have Jean-Michel Hannay for a speaker this morning. I was super excited to have him talk about some of the work that he's been doing with biological nitrogen fixation in corn, but unfortunately, which has been the case for the past month, I think, here in Madison. He's ill, so instead you're going to hear from me this morning. I'm going to be talking about regenerative organic agriculture and how that relates to a global health crisis. Doesn't sound inspiring, but I hope by the end of the talk you guys are inspired to keep pushing on with respect to innovating with regenerative organic agriculture. This is the same talk I gave at Acres here about a month ago, so I apologize if any of you were at Acres. A lot of this might sound familiar, but also glad to be able to pinch hit with a speaker, the absence of a speaker this morning. Yeah, so to launch into the talk this morning before moving on to our concurrent sessions. So as I mentioned, what I would like to be able to talk to you about today is our global health crisis. And this is a crisis not only with respect to human health and community health, but also with respect to the health of our environment. But want to move into then how regenerative organic can serve as a solution for that. As I mentioned, I'm a professor of organic and sustainable cropping systems here at UW-Madison. I also have the role as the director for the Center for Integrated Ag Systems, which has been around for about 30 years looking at addressing the issues facing our food system with respect to industrialization, commoditization, and moving in a direction that is unfortunately not doing any favors for our environment nor our communities. All right, well, as farmers, soil is something that everyone in this room is very familiar with. But from a broader societal standpoint, soil is often an undervalued resource, and it is a resource that is of great risk. Wendy talked yesterday about some of what she's been seeing with respect to soil from neighboring fields moving onto her farm fields. I mean, this is a reality. It's a reality we face across much of the country, certainly what we face here in the upper Midwest. Soil is often something that we see in construction sites referred to as dirt. People think of it as potentially a nuisance, but it really underlies our national food security and our environmental and human community health more broadly. So what is soil? Soil is an amazing environment. It is dynamic, it is heterogeneous. It is a complex mixture that creates a home for the soil biology that really fuels our organic ag systems. It's comprised of water and air. And I was talking to someone yesterday, I think oftentimes we ignore the air component, how important that air component is of the soil environment to foster soil biology, to help create a structure and an environment to help the ecology to survive, which is a factor of how we treat our soils, how we manage our soils to avoid compaction. The water component is essential as well, and how do we move water through the system to feed our plants, to feed our soil biology, and create an environment where living organisms can thrive. Another important part of soil is the geological and mineral material, the sand, silt, and clay particles that have arisen from the historic genesis of these soils. And depending on what the combination of sand, silt, and clay is, you can have a very different environment, both from a farming perspective as well from an ecology perspective. A big part of the soil that we're learning more and more about is that living component, the decomposing plants, animals, and microorganisms. And there's an amazing number, a huge number of microorganisms, bacteria that live in the soil, 1 billion bacteria per gram of soil. So the soil environment is absolutely teeming with life. Another key element of soil, which makes it so hard as a resource to regenerate and so frustrating, I think, from a farmer component, from a farmer perspective, when you're looking at bringing regenerative practices on your farm, is time. The soil that we see on our prairies, the soil that you see on your farms is a result of centuries, thousands of years, millennia of the genesis of that soil, the weathering of that soil, the organic matter that's contributed to that soil. It takes time to build and regenerate our soil. And as we think about the soil loss and how long that is going to take to regenerate that soil, or even from a perspective in terms of soil health, and when you implement different practices, how soon you can see a response from your soil. It takes time for these practices, whether it be cover cropping or diversification, to lead to a measurable change in soil health. That time component is essential. They're also dynamic systems. They're always changing. The weather, the water status, how you manage the soil, the sorts of plants, the sorts of living roots, that's going to change the soil biology, and that's going to change the function of soil. From a research perspective, it's incredibly exciting to work with soils because of this complexity and dynamism. But unfortunately, in terms of being able to find answers to be able to help guide farmers into the best practices and best ways to move forward to soil health, it's not a one-size-fits-all recipe. Because of this dynamic aspect, because of the diversity of soils, it's oftentimes something that requires site-specific management, and the response differs by site. Like I mentioned, it takes a long time for soil to form. So as we look at the soil loss we're experiencing across the country, it truly is a crisis. We are not going to be able to regain that soil that we're losing anytime quickly. It forms due to the chemical and physical reactions of the parent geological material, this weathering of the soil, and that's really, again, what's taken the millennia for some of those different soils to form. But the plants, the animals, the bacteria that come together to form that topsoil, that most fertile layer that we rely on for plant productivity, that also takes time. And as organic farmers, many of you that have been doing this for decades, you've seen those changes on your farms, you've seen those gains in soil organic matter, but that's not going to happen overnight. Soil formation is incredibly slow, 0.5 ton per acre a year, which equates to about 1/100th of an inch. So it takes patience, it takes commitment, and it's not something that's easy to regain once it's lost. The value of healthy soil for resilience. So as farmers, looking at the resilience of our farm to withstand the challenges that are faced in a farming system. And some of those challenges are related to weather. We talked about the extreme weather events that are increasingly being faced, those heavy rains, those flooding events, the droughts we've been seeing, oscillating from a drought in 2023 to excessive rains in 2024. That resilience of the system, but also the resilience of the economic system, being able to buffer the swings in prices that we see, the changes of the global organic market, and to be able to create that resilience so that the next generation has confidence that when they go back to the farm, they're going to have a livelihood that's going to allow them to support families and thrive. And soils, healthy soils, are a key aspect of that resilience, a key aspect to stable food security. And I want to emphasize that technology is certainly a part of organic, certainly a part of our food systems moving forward, but technology is not going to be able to solve our issues related to soil loss and food security. Our farming practices, the way that we support our farmers doing the right thing, the creation of diverse markets, and the creation of regional food systems that are going to buffer against global economic shocks and global shocks with respect to supply chains, that's what's going to help with food security, stable food security. Healthy soils are also key to water quality, whether it's looking at the direct entry of soil into our waterways, as we see with erosion from extreme weather events, but also with respect to water quality in terms of bacteria and microorganisms. Soil can act as a powerful filter to keep pathogenic organisms from moving into our water. So as we look at food safety issues, looking at issues with respect to inappropriate manure applications or some of the issues with E. coli and other pathogens we see on leafy greens, healthy soils can contribute to mitigating those risks. Healthy soils are important to biodiversity, and part of this is the biodiversity within the soil environment itself, and we'll talk a little bit about how that contributes to different aspects of not only our human health, but also our agricultural management. But the other biodiversity aspects as well, in terms of being able to support diverse plant communities, which then are able to support diverse wildlife, birds, mammals. Antibiotic and product discovery. It's interesting to note that the majority of antibiotics have come from a soil environment. So when we look at finding solutions to human health, the soil environment is a rich environment to help find new ways to be able to look at some of the challenges we're facing in terms of global health or societal health. And also carbon in the soil. As we look at mitigating some of the issues we see with climate change and the atmospheric CO2, being able to return that carbon back to the soil can act as a key way to help mitigate some of the other human activities that we're doing that contribute to climate change. So I mentioned antibiotics and how soil is a rich environment, incredibly valuable environment to find new antibiotics that can help with human and livestock health. But it also has been a rich environment to help find other tools that help with agricultural management in a more environmentally friendly way. And spinosad, which is something that if you're using this for a pesticide or insect management, you might be familiar with in an organic context, is something that's allowable by the National Organic Program. And this is a soil microbe that was found, I believe, under a rum still in the Caribbean, and has been used then to be able to target insects in organic and conventional systems. So something that's a more friendly insecticide to help with our agricultural management and mitigate some of the unintended consequences of pesticide applications. But there's other examples of marketed compounds originating from the soil biology. Penicillin, cephalosporin, streptomycin, some antibiotics that you all might be familiar with and know how critical they are for the continued treatment of different diseases and human health issues. Immunosuppressants, anti-tumor drugs, anti-migraine drugs, lipase inhibitors. So there's a lot of value to the soil that as we lose soil and lose that diversity, we're potentially losing some of these tools that are important from a healthcare perspective. We are, again, losing a lot of soil carbon under our current management of our agricultural systems more broadly. There is 2,500 billion tons of organic carbon in the top 2 meters of soil, which is greater than 3 times the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and 4 to 5 times the carbon in all plant biomass on Earth. So it's a tremendous source and repository of carbon. And as we look at the fluxes between carbon in the soil versus the environment, it's frightening to recognize that we've lost 50% of soil's carbon since 1850. That's a tremendous amount of soil that's been taken from being bound in that soil environment, that's been put out into the atmosphere, that is also losing a valuable aspect of soil health and management. One thing that has really struck me in recent years when I think about the complex interactions between the plants and their environment is how plants actively modify their soil environment. So I think we, at least when I was going through school, had often thought of plants as a more sessile, inactive part of the environment, that they weren't actively modifying the soil, the plant communities around them. But in fact, plants are very active in terms of modifying the environment around them to their benefit. So we know that plants fix carbon. They are an organism that can take the carbon dioxide from the air and through photosynthesis, put that into energy through sugars that we then use for food, that we then can use for our own energy. But it's interesting to note that roots release a tremendous amount of carbon to the soil. And plants are fixing carbon for their own energy, so for their own growth. So when we look at efficiency of plants, it is really striking to note how inefficient, theoretically, it might be for plants to take that carbon that they fixed and pump it right back into the soil and not use it for growth. About a third of the carbon that is fixed through photosynthesis is pumped back into the soil. But it is, when you take it into the context of the plants actively modifying their environment, that expenditure of energy, that expenditure of resources makes sense. So the microbes around those plant roots can convert that carbon to sticky carbohydrates that glue the soil particles together and create the architecture of the soil. So that relationship between the plant and the soil biology is essentially creating a better root environment for the plant to be able to access nutrients and water. So having that symbiotic relationship is helping the plant. There's also other relationships between soil biology in terms of being able to unlock soil nutrients, to be able to actively look at fighting pathogens to be able to upregulate the plant defense mechanism. So there's so many complex interactions that the plant is fostering within the soil biological community that then helps their productivity, that helps their health, that helps the general environment around the plant. So as a farming community, it's important as we think about creating healthy, resilient systems that we recognize this complexity and how important that soil biological aspect is to healthy soils and healthy plants. Unfortunately, not all of our soils are healthy. We know that soil is essential for life on Earth, but as mentioned yesterday, it is eroding at alarming rates across the globe. And just some examples of what we've been seeing in the last 5 years or so. With respect to wind and water erosion, wind erosion is dramatic. And as I look at my own journey in sustainable agriculture, I started in eastern Washington and then moved to New Mexico. And those are dry land environments. And as I was driving across the landscape, visiting farms, one of the things that really struck me was the amount of soil that was literally moving into the air, and you could visually see it leaving farm fields and moving across roads, going into the air, affecting our air quality, affecting our health in terms of road safety, traffic safety. And that is one of the biggest things that got me on my journey to sustainable and organic agriculture, was that visual soil loss I was seeing in those dryland environments. They are dramatic visual events, and they redistribute 1 to 4 gigatons of soil globally. And interestingly, this movement happens on an incredible global level. So some places, such as Brazil, can benefit from this soil loss. There's actually evidence from satellites of the dust that is moving from the Sahara Desert across the ocean into Brazil. So the soil loss can be enormous, and it can affect things on a global level. Incredible amount of movement of soil in the atmosphere. And this is not very much different from what I described to you from what I was seeing in New Mexico. And this is a recent article, I believe it was just from last year, 2024. Some of you might be from Illinois, and some of you might recognize this, the havoc of some of the dust storms that were in Illinois and caused major traffic incidents on I-55. So we are increasingly seeing these incidents of soil moving and how it's impacting not only our farm productivity, but also other aspects of community safety and health. Impacts of water. Water is also a significant source of soil loss. It causes erosion, whether it's surface erosion. It can also cause erosion to happen throughout the soil profile, but it also impacts compaction as well. So creating an environment where we don't get that airflow, which is critical to fostering soil biology. It is eroding rapidly under these different pressures of wind and water with an erosion rate of 5 tons per acre per year. And you can contrast that to the figures I gave you with respect to what it takes to regain that soil. And that number generally ignores gully erosion. So that could be contributing much more than what has been projected with the values that I just cited. And as we see more severe weather events, especially heavy rainfalls, these events are going to be more frequent. And in Iowa, as Wendy discussed, we saw 50 tons of acre per year lost in one rainstorm on thousands of acres. So it's impacting on a regional scale. And when we look at the soil depletions in Iowa, so a professor at UW-Madison, Jo Handelsman, she worked in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and she saw as one of the biggest challenges that we're facing as a nation from a science and technology perspective was this loss of soil. So she had her office while she was working with the administration to look at projected soil loss, and under different models, looking at the potential loss in Iowa, we can see that even just with what we've currently experienced, not necessarily even thinking about what's going to happen in the future, that in 2019, 25% of Iowa's cropland had no topsoil. Amazing amount of topsoil loss, and as we look at the different projections, it's going to increase that impact across the landscape. Rainfall and compaction, we mentioned the extreme weather events, and those extreme weather events are heavy rains. And when we look at the impact of a raindrop itself, they hit the ground typically at 20 miles an hour, and that impact of 1 million raindrops hitting the ground is the 40 inches of rain across a 2.5 acre land delivers a force of 1 ton of TNT. It's an amazing, and when you think about a raindrop hitting bare soil, the impact, little impact that has on that soil environment. Dislodges soil particles, it can splash them 3.5 feet away. And this is where we get that erosion, or quote unquote erosion through the soil profile, those pores that they get clogged by those splash soil profiles, that the rain destroys soil structure, and essentially those small disrupted particles can clog soil pores, and that impacts our air movement, that impacts water throughout the soil profile. And this is, I think, in part what we're seeing when we look at where chemical no-till has broken down and how we go across the landscape and we drive past farm fields that may have been with conventional chemical no-till, we still see water pooling on those fields, in part because of the compaction issues that we see when we're farming with bare soil. So the impact of rainfall, particularly on unarmored soil, bare soil, is incredible. More examples of this happening over recent years. So this is a photo from 2021. This is from Europe, but some of the enormous flooding events, excessive rain events in Europe, and you can see the degree of soil loss, and it basically just opening up, ripping the landscape open, and these flooding deaths, flooding also resulting in deaths. Just to make a connection between soil health and human health, we talked about antibiotics and it being used as a tool. This gets definitely kind of on the edge of science, I'll admit, but looking at the relationship more broadly in terms of the agroecosystem, our ecosystem, of how organisms have evolved together, including how, as people, we've evolved to have those same interactions that I described the plant having with its microbiome, its microenvironment, ourselves, and how our gut microbiome, similar to what we're learning with respect to the soil environment, how microbes impact our own health through our gut microbiome and through other interactions. So this old friends hypothesis is essentially stating that the microbes that within our mammalian immune systems have co-evolved with us, that there's these intricate relationships between our human immune defense systems and the microbes that essentially inhabit us through our gut, on our skin, throughout our bodies. So Rook, a scientist out of, I believe, Great Britain, Rook, proposed that these significant microbes include ambient species that coexist in the environment, and again, species that really have co-evolved with us, that inhabit our skin, our gut, our respiratory tract, not only of ourselves, but also the animals that are also part of our ecosystem. So some examples may be the bacteria that are present in soil, water, and food. And these impacts, these transient impacts that, like our soil environment and our own human body environment, are changing, are apt to be changing depending on our diet, depending on our environment, depending on our health status, stress. They're essential for maintaining a healthy immune system in humans. But unfortunately, our agricultural practices across the majority of our landscape are affecting our health. And I'm going to talk about that in two respects, hormones and pesticides. So this is a recent study, just published in 2024, that's looking at across our food system the estimated human intake of endogenous and exogenous hormones from beef in the U.S. So one of the authors of this, Asa Bradman, just as another plug for something that you all might be interested in April, UW-Madison is hosting a forum on campus called Organic Agriculture as a Solution for Global Health Challenges. And again, taking this broader approach of health challenges, not only in our environment, but also in our communities, also in terms of economic health, as well as human health. And one of the speakers is one of the authors on this paper, Asa Bradman, who's a professor in the UC system. And essentially, this paper is looking at how these hormones are present in the beef supply that we have in the U.S. So this 2024 study estimated the daily intake of several of these compounds that are basically hormones that are present within our food supply in terms of what their presence are in retail beef. And they estimated, when they looked at dietary patterns and the concentration of these hormones, the estimated intake was highest for young children. And again, as we look at supporting health of our communities and health of the next generation, and the sensitivity that children have in terms of exposure to hormones, this is concerning for sure. And potentially adverse effects, these can happen during the sensitive developmental periods, including what we see as our children are maturing. And it's throughout this, one of the conclusions of the study is that something that we need to look at more closely, and how to look at developing recommendations that take into account the impacts of these compounds being present in our food supply, and how we might want to limit them to particularly at populations such as children that are sensitive to the exposure to hormones. How might we address those issues? This is a striking figure as well in terms of the impact of our agricultural practice on human health, looking at cancer risks on farms. So this is another recent study, and this is from Southern Illinois University. So as I put together this presentation, I was really trying to focus on where is our science and what research has been done to more directly link the impacts of what we're doing on the environment to different aspects of health. And this is something that is from several different schools of medicine have documented this. So this is another recent paper, 2024, this came out, and this paper is looking at the pesticide exposure in wells and how that relates to cancer incidence across the nation. The darker blue is the higher incidence of cancer, and you can see how that basically overlays our Corn Belt. So as we look at what we're doing on our land in the Corn Belt, how that's impacting the quality of our water, the level of pesticides in our wells, and then how that's impacting cancer rates across the country. So looking at the conclusions from that study, our findings have demonstrated an association between pesticide use and increased incidence of leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, bladder, colon, and lung cancer, pancreatic cancer, and essentially all cancers combined that they evaluated in this study, and particularly links to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, leukemia, and bladder cancer. And these were more pronounced than the effects of smoking. So looking at how it's recognized how smoking has an impact of human health, what we're doing in terms of our land management, what we're doing in terms of pesticide applications, have an even more pronounced effect than what smoking has had across the U.S. population. Another university entity making some of these statements, Lowell Center for Sustainable Production at UMass and the Boston University School of Public Health, stating something similar, recognizing the link between agriculture and cancer and a need for action. Studies of farming populations routinely reveal elevated risk of several specific types of cancer. Again, same sorts of issues that were cited in that other study. Multiple studies are making these connections, and we need to address the risk of what we're seeing within our water supply and how it's affecting our communities. Another paper looking at the impacts of soils and human health, from food supplies to water infiltration to chemical and pathogen exposures. Soils influence health in more ways than most of us realize. So we are at a point within a society, within our agricultural community, that we really do need to have a really frank discussion and really start to ask those important questions that Wendy asked yesterday. How do we move forward? We know these risks. We know we're losing our soil. We know that's going to impact productivity and food security. We know that it's having an impact on the health of our communities, the health of our people. We know that it's having issues with respect to our economic health and being able to maintain the next generation on the farm, to be able to keep families farming, to be able to bring new people into farming. How do we move forward? How do we change our farming practices that the soil will last, the soil will be healthier, and not just for our crops and people, but our animals too. And healthy animals lead to healthier food for people. We want farming to be more profitable. We need farming to be more profitable. And Wendy mentioned that too yesterday. We can't ignore the economic component. We need to create structures, markets, incentives that allow farmers to take on these new practices that do come with risk, be able to do it though instead of a Band-Aid way, a preventative way, that we're mitigating that risk for farmers and a preventative way to mitigate these broader risks to society. We want our waterways to be clear. A lot of us too within Wisconsin, Minnesota, water is part of our culture. Water is part of our environment, is part of what we do within our communities, what we do for recreation, an important part of how we live, how we interact with our landscape. And the loss of that clean water through our agricultural farming is impacting us more broadly as a community in the upper Midwest, in the Great Lakes region. And we want farming practices that create less health risk. So just talking about some of the farming practices that can improve human and soil health, we know that human intervention of soils can damage our soils. And we know that in the past, this is called downfalls of civilizations. This has caused collapses, and if we don't recognize this and learn from history, we're going to see some of those same dynamics. So this is from a paper that was actually published through, again, a government entity, bringing together scientists from across the country to look very, very deeply into the impacts of soil onto so many different aspects of environmental and human health. And looking at these interactions between our earth system, food systems, microbiome, and how those impact our global community. So some examples, when we look at the measurable characteristics of health and healthy soils, we have the biological component, we have the biochemical component, we have the physical component. And like I mentioned, in terms of some of the parallels between what we see in the soil microbiome and our human microbiome, this is something that struck me as I was understanding more about the importance of the soil ecology component, how many parallels there are to what we're also, like I mentioned before, recognizing how much the gut microbiome, how much more of a systems-based approach is needed for the support of human health as well. And there's some parallels too in terms of what we measure in terms of our own health, whether it be blood tests or temperature, heart rate, how much we function in terms of our mobility, to how we might measure the soil and the soil health in terms of nutrient competition, depth of topsoil, water holding capacity. A lot of amazing parallels across the measure of health of ecological systems. Looking at soil as a repository, a reservoir for these essential microorganisms. So it's a little bit hard to see, but when we look at the circles here in the different colors, that's representing a distribution of different types of bacteria. So you can see our own gut microbiome, which at least in this characterization is a bit less complex than when we look at the plant microbiome, and even looking at the rumen microbiome, more complex than the human microbiome. But then looking at the soil microbiome, emphasizing once more how incredibly complex and how incredibly critical that is to be able to support the other dependent microbiomes across our ecosystem. So 5 soil health principles, I think most of you have seen these in various presentations. NRCS has promoted these as ways to look at characterizing a healthy soil and how we might design practices to support that. Principle 1, soil armor. This is a key aspect of not only helping with wind erosion by protecting and covering the soil, but also mitigating that impact of water and the heavy rainfalls that I mentioned. Armoring the soil protects our soil. Also protects our soil from extremes in temperatures. Mentioned when looking at those different measures of soil and human health, some of those parallels, and one of the measures of our own health is temperature. The soil can also respond to temperature, and particularly when we look at the soil biology, creating an environment of bare soil that is baking in the sun and can be very, very hot. If you've measured the temperature of your soil, of bare, dark soil on a sunny day, that can cause these modulations in temperatures that is not only going to impact the soil biology, but also potentially plant roots and plant stress. So the soil armor is such an important part of the protection and the mediation of soils. Minimizing soil disturbance. And we do a lot of work in organic no-till. Organic no-till is not a system that is readily adoptable right now. But I want to emphasize, when we look at the soil health practices, the emphasis is minimizing soil disturbance. As organic farmers, we certainly don't want to get out there and be doing recreational tillage, not only for our soil health, but also for the economics and just the logistics of labor on our farms. I don't think anyone here is wanting to do recreational tillage. So looking at how do we minimize our tillage, either through the number of tillage passes, how we're using cover crops and crop diversity and crop sequencing to minimize tillage, and also the impacts of our tillage tools. Are there different tools we can use that can more strategically disturb the soil without putting it at risk? Plant diversity. As I mentioned opening the conference yesterday, diversity is such an important part of organic agriculture. And looking at some of the most successful farms that I've seen that have managed organically across decades, one of the key common characteristics is diversity. Moving from a 3-crop rotation to a 7 and 8 crop rotation. And how that not only helps with weed management, how that helps with opening up opportunities for cover cropping and adding fertility to the system, but also potentially fostering soil microbial diversity as well. Continued living plants and roots as part of the soil system. And this is another key aspect where I see organic farmers really thriving and being a key part of the solution. How do we design rotations, put in cover crops, that there's always a living root in the soil? So through winter cover crops like hairy vetch or a cereal rye. As I mentioned previously, there's a lot of sugars, a lot of food that's being pumped from the plants into the soil system. And granted, during the winter, the soil is not going to be necessarily very active with our temperatures being lower. But even on the shoulders of our winter season, you can imagine if you're taking away that food source from the microbes and how important those microbes are for soil structure and soil function, how much by having that bare soil without those living roots and food sources can be impacting the stability, the resilience, the health of our soil biological systems. So those living roots are so critical for not only protecting and holding the soil from threats with water erosion, but also for fostering the soil biology. And then livestock integration. Recognizing that is more of a challenge, particularly for grain commodity farmers. But I think Wendy offered some inspirations yesterday in terms of how we might think about integrating livestock to our systems. In Wisconsin, I think there is such an opportunity, another economic opportunity for farmers to be grazing dairy heifers and young stock. We have dairy heifers being shipped to Texas. Why are we shipping them to Texas when we have farms here in Wisconsin that could be putting those animals on their land as part of the organic rotation, being able to get value from those animals being on the land, not only values in terms of payments for taking care of those animals, but the value of the manure those animals are depositing, the value of being able to take some of those regenerative phases and use them as forage. We need to look at changing our system and figuring out how can we make those opportunities for our farmers here in the upper Midwest instead of shipping those animals to Texas. And some of that might be incentives in terms of some of the infrastructure that Wendy talked about. How do we get fencing onto our fields? How do we get water onto our fields? But rethinking the system of how do we create these more integrated partnerships that allow us to be able to really maximize our ability to address these 5 soil health principles. So just giving some examples within the organic context, soil armor. So again, we do a lot of research on roller crimping, so not to necessarily promote this as the only answer, certainly isn't the only answer, but just how roller crimping plays a role in this. When we look at the amount of biomass that is protecting the soil and how that's protecting against the extreme weather events, how that's protecting from winds, even here in the Midwest, like that photograph in Illinois, but also the derechos we've been seeing across Iowa and even Wisconsin last year, we have high wind events that are moving our soil. So how do we keep that protected? Again, the work that we're doing with living cover crops as well. And this is a vegetable system. So this is with summer squash, but this is organic. And looking at putting in these living covers after planting and establishing this very robust ground cover. So in this field here, this was probably, about 5 or 5 or 8 years ago, and this is a photograph of a field where we had in August an 8-inch rain event, and that 8-inch rain came within about an hour period. And looking at how this system was able to withstand that stress versus the bare ground you see behind, where we saw washouts, rill erosion, gully erosion, the protection that living cover is able to sustain. And as we look in developing grain systems, one of the things that we see as potential ways to move forward that we need to come together collaboratively for research is you see here in this vegetable system how wide those rows are where we're managing for the vegetable crop, and then how we're strategically placing the cover crop. How do we design similar systems for grain crops through strip tillage and through other technologies? This is some of you may have seen this in various demonstrations. It's a rainfall simulator that NRCS often brings around. And what they do is they essentially take different chunks of soil from fields that have been managed differently. So on the far right here, you can see a field that is bare ground, no cover crops, probably managed with conventional chemicals. And right next to that, you see what is a roller crimpered field. So you can kind of see that rye biomass on there. Next to them, you see various aspects of pasture and alfalfa. But what I want to note is the difference between those jars that you see underneath the far right, the bare ground, and the one next to it, which is a roller crimp crop. And the way that these rainfall simulators work is that there is a sprinkler that goes over these different chunks of soil, sprinkles on the rain, in a level, a rate that is not an excessive rain, but I would say a standard rain, and looks at how much water infiltrates down through those chunks, which have been taken in a way that we're not causing compaction, we're not disturbing the soil structure, and then measuring from these front jars, modeling how much water is running off the field versus the back jars, which is how much water is going down into the field where we need it. We want that water to go into the fields, into the soil profile where the roots can access. So again, showing the impact of this armor in that bare ground field, you see how much water has run off that field, how deep that water in the jug is, and how dark it is, how much soil has moved off those fields, versus the roller crimp field where we see much less loss of water that would have been eroded across the field, and much less soil moving with it. So a visual demonstration of how that soil armor is practically, in a very effective way, helping create an environment where water is maintaining within the soil root zone, within the plant root zone, and keeping soil in place. Diverse crop rotation, so critical for organic management and so critical for our soil health. This is a photograph here that is looking at the complexity of different rotations, simple versus complex rotations, and the probability of crop failures with those different systems. So the simple rotations are the purple lines. I'm not sure how easy that is to see. And the complex rotations are the green lines. And you see across the y-axis there, the abbreviations of where that was measured: Colorado, South Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska. And you can see when you look at the left-hand side of the graph, which is measuring an increased risk of crop failure, how much those simple rotations, how many more of those purple bars are on that left side of increased risk versus the green, which is on the right side, which is increased opportunity for a bumper crop. So this isn't going to be every year that a complex rotation outperforms, but when we look at mitigating risk and creating resilience, these studies have found that having a more complex rotation is going to increase the probability over time of a bumper crop and help buffer against crop failures. So Band-Aids versus preventative. Are we setting up a system where we set up the expectation for needing those Band-Aids, or do we set up a preventative system?
Diversity in terms of diverse pastures, and this is where integration of livestock can be such a valuable component if we can figure out how to do it, if we can create the relationships, if we can help support the infrastructure. That diverse pasture can help bring in legumes, which is a key part of a sustainable soil fertility management in organic, reduce the cost of having to bring in imported nitrogen, helps create a system where you have more buffering against the prices of fertility. We've seen issues with the availability of composted chicken manure, which is a big part of organic fertility management, as we look at the risk of avian flu and the shutdown of those facilities. So putting in legumes in the system is, again, helping resilience in terms of being able to withstand supply and price shocks. Intercropping, ways of adding diversity through novel ways of planting crops. And I've seen farmers do this in a practical way, growing strips of bean and cereal grains together. And this is where I think working together in partnership of farmers that do an incredible amount of innovation on your farms with equipment companies, looking at where there's opportunity and growth and where we need to go as an agriculture community, and researchers that are able to help create help collect some of the data, both on farm and on our experiment stations, to see how these systems work. I think a lot of the bottlenecks in these systems is not our ability to do them and farmers to do them. Farmers are amazing at growing crops and finding ways to grow crops, but it's not having necessarily the equipment to be able to do this, both in terms of planting and harvest and management, as well as some of the genetics and some of the varieties. And maybe those varieties are out there and we just don't know it. How do we pair these together in a way that is feasible, that we maintain the quality we need, we maintain the practical aspects of management, but can help foster this diversity and resilience in the field? I had the opportunity to go to China a few years ago, and it was actually really striking to me on the visit, and surprisingly so, how much diversity in the systems that I was seeing in China, including these agroforestry systems. And this is a photo of where there's a perennial system and then some leafy brassica greens. Can we do this? Obviously in China, there's a lot more availability of cheap manual labor. But again, from a technology solution, what is holding us back from being able to do this? You can imagine potentially with autonomous technology, with drones that can help for planting, with autonomous weeding robots, how, whereas this wasn't necessarily manageable from a scale that we do in the US, given our current technology and equipment, if we're putting our efforts to making these systems work, how might we look at using technology and developing innovation to create ways to make these diverse systems practical within our US farming systems? This is one of the easiest practical ways of putting continuous living roots in the soil, underseeding with legumes. And if you're not doing this as an organic farmer, I would encourage you to adopt this practice. So this is looking at frost seeding legumes into a winter wheat crop. So coming in late February, early March, when we're starting to get those freeze-thaw events, typically having to come in early morning before the sun's coming out, and where you get some of that thaw and that cracking and freezing and thawing of the soil, overseeding red clover. That red clover will just hang out under that wheat crop, and it won't look like much until wheat harvest, but once you harvest that wheat in August, that red clover just takes off and has this incredibly lush field. And when you think of red clover, you should be thinking of nitrogen. And if you're following this with corn, how much nitrogen that you're able to get from this clover crop. And this clover crop is growing all winter. Not growing all winter, but hanging out all winter. So you have the benefit of those living roots. Legumes in particular are such a powerful tool in terms of fostering soil biology. Such an easy way to establish an overwintering cover crop that feeds our soil and also feeds our next crop, which could be a corn crop in the organic rotation. We've been doing a lot of work with interseeding and looking at how to establish a cover crop under a standing corn crop, so coming in around V3 of corn, planting annual ryegrass, planting red clover. And what we've seen from some of these studies is we're able to eliminate a couple cultivation passes. So we might do blind cultivation, tine weeding, and rotary hoeing, but establishing these cover crops, we don't have to go in and do a row cultivation, so that could be 1 or 2 cultivation passes that are eliminated. And we're getting that benefit of the diversity and living roots in the soil. And again, integrating livestock and thinking, how can we do this? What is the technology that we need? What role can tools like virtual fencing play? How can we use some of these conservation programs to be able to support this? And how do we develop the relationships with our dairy and livestock industry across the region? And one thing to note in organic is that these animals don't have to be coming from an organic farm. We can have these relationships of supporting dairy heifers on our lands without having them be from a organic farm, and that was completely allowable within an organic system. So how do we make these relationships with our conventional neighbors to be able to get livestock onto our land? Just to wrap up with some thoughts, particularly about organic agriculture, it's continuing to grow. And we'll hear more about some of the supply and demand dynamics, but from a consumer standpoint, consumers are interested. They're maintaining their interest, they're growing their interest. And we know from the history of organic was founded on the recognition of the importance of soil. Oftentimes the consumers think of it from looking at the lack of pesticides and the lack of chemicals sprayed, but that is not where the foundational principles of organic are. The foundational principles are grounded, literally grounded in the soil. And this recognition that soil health and plant health impacts animal health, impacts human health, and the complexity of these relationships and how our management impacts our entire ecosystem. It's also grounded on a foundational focus of proactive ecology versus reactive chemistry. And that ties back to, again, this paradigm of looking at these Band-Aids in terms of our management versus our preventative ways of mitigating risk. So organic, by the way we manage, is taking on more of that preventative approach, developing systems that create resilience and buffer against some of the stresses that we see, whether they be environmental or economic stresses, and this emphasis on diversity. So looking at conventional versus organic cropping systems, I just want to stress again from multiple sites, including in Minnesota and Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, that organic yields of corn and soybeans and small grains can be very competitive with conventional. Organic can be extremely productive, and there's other different political discussion that could be had about the U.S. farmers feeding the world. But if we look at the criticism of organic and potentially low yields and the risk to food security, I don't think that necessarily bears out. Organic productions can be very productive, and it really hinges on weed control. I mean, obviously there's other issues with drought and excessive water that can impact as well. But looking at these long-term studies, in the years where there's good weed control, this is where we can get, as we look at these numbers, yield as a percent of the conventional system, yields that are 98, 94% of the conventional system. It's when we have poor weed management that organic yields struggle. So looking at how do we really move forward these relationships between soil health and weed management. Just specifically with organic, just wanted to stress that there are studies, we mentioned the impact of pesticides and cancer and hormones and risk to children, that organic diets have been shown through multiple studies to reduce the risk of exposure to pesticides. And this is one study from 2019 that looked at organic diet as an intervention for urinary pesticide levels in U.S. adults and children. And basically what happened to this study is days 1 through 5, the study participants followed their normal conventional diet, ate what they did, not necessarily organic food. And then days 6 to 11, all the family members throughout their home, their work, childcare situations, had all organic food across all food categories. And then after the switch to organic food, the urine metabolites were measured. And what was found was that there was a profound decrease in urinary metabolite concentration of these different pesticides when the participants moved from a conventional to organic diet, particularly of some pesticides that are related to the neonicotinoid class. So having an organic diet has been demonstrated to lower the risk of exposure of these different pesticides. Looking particularly at neonicotinoids, which is again, one of the classes that was most impacted in terms of reduction, there is more data coming out as well in terms of the impacts of those pesticides on developmental neurotoxicity. So looking again at how we're putting our children at risk by our farming practices. So in closing, I just want to applaud you all for the work that you're doing, whether as organic farmers, as people supporting the organic industry. Organic farming is not easy. It is in no way easy with the amount of diversity and complexity and the work that needs to be done to identify markets, the relationships that need to be built, the amount of knowledge that needs to be gained to be successful at organic farming. Going against the grain, some of what we've been hearing about within our conversations throughout the last couple of days are examples of, as an organic farmer, you don't necessarily have a neighbor that you can rely on for ideas. To find a community, to find knowledge, it can be a very alienating place. Sometimes your conventional neighbors are looking at you like you're crazy, making judgments. And when you're in a small rural community, that can be hard. So everyone in this room that is farming organic, you are making a difference. You are making a difference in terms of soil health. You're making a difference in terms of community health. And the recognition of the hard work you're doing, the role that you're playing, and the leadership the folks here in this room are playing in terms of bringing our agriculture forward in the ways it needs to be. We need to continue to be able to demonstrate this message, to demonstrate the impacts, and demonstrate the value of the investment that is being made in organic agriculture, not only with respect to supporting the farmers that are taking on the risk, that are doing this hard work to create a structure where it's not Band-Aids, that it's helping to support farmers and being able to adopt these preventative measures, but also with the research and the R&D that's needed to make organic come forward. Organic is not separate from technology. Technology plays a key part in organic, and science plays a key part in organic. And bringing us together as a community, farmers working together with researchers, working together with industry partners to find solutions and that innovation. Farmers are incredibly innovative. You do a lot of innovation and research on your own farm. How can we create systems that can support you so you're not taking on all the risk and cost of that innovation? So looking forward into the next, as we go into the second half of this decade, to continue to work together to find these solutions, to bring us forward in this cropping system, in this food system direction that we need to go, and really look forward to working with you all throughout the OGRAIN network and partnerships across the organic community to continue to bring us forward. So thank you, and I'm happy to take on any questions or have discussion. So someone from the medical field.
No, that's a great summary. We're learning more and more about the gut microbiome, and that's really been in the past 10 years, so thank you for highlighting that. About 10 years ago, on what I'll call the conventional organic ground at Arlington, you were seeing organic matter, a signal that was concerning. I think there was maybe even, it might have been a non-significant decline. Mm-hmm. What has been the trend on the conventional organic fields at Arlington, and was there specific practices that were identified as contributors?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So what we've been seeing in our long-term trial, and I think, next year for the conference, would love to have Jean-Michel Hannay come when he's not ill and talk about some of the work he's been doing with nitrogen fixation. But we should also have Greg Sanford come and talk, because he did do some ecological intensification studies. So what has been found at Arlington is that basically all of the systems that are represented, which were developed as common cropping systems in Wisconsin, so a conventional corn monoculture, just corn on corn, a corn soybean rotation with best sustainable practices, so reduced tillage, conservation practices, an organic corn, soybean, wheat rotation, and then conventional forage rotation of corn alfalfa, organic rotation of corn alfalfa, and then the managed grazing. Basically, all systems were losing carbon with the recognition that Arlington has incredibly rich, deep mollisol soils that had a very high starting place with carbon. So we weren't seeing a building of carbon in the organic system. We weren't seeing any more loss in the organic system with tillage than in the conservation cropping system, but we weren't seeing the gains. So why weren't we seeing the gains in that system? I would argue that this is partly because of the lack of diversity that I think really is going to help enhance the impacts of an organic system. It's only a 3-crop rotation of corn, soybean, wheat, and there isn't enough cover crop to be adding carbon back into the soil on that very stripped down rotation. So what Greg has done is to try to put in more opportunities for biointensification with cover crops. I'd be super curious to see if that's helped mitigate it. So I think some of those initial data that you might have seen was after 20 years. After 30 years of management, we are, I believe, starting to see more of an equilibrium with organics. So we're still seeing losses in the conventional system of carbon in terms of row cropping. There's a stabilization, if not a little bit of recovery in organic systems. But I think that data is really reflecting on both, the need for recognition that we are going to see different gains and different rate of gains under different soil types. So when we look at trying to understand either reward from carbon accrual in soils or what we can anticipate in terms of carbon accrual, one of the reasons why it's difficult is because that differs so much across environments and across soil types and across water status, temperatures, et cetera. But I also think it really, again, highlights the fact that we need to focus on this addition of diversity. But to do that diversity, we need the markets.
So, Dr. Silva, maybe this is a dumb question, but since the first hunter-gatherer stopped and decided not to hunt or gather and put a seed in the ground and become a farmer, we've been taking essentially more out of the system than we're putting back in. Mm-hmm. And is it unrealistic to expect that to be able to change in a agrarian system rather than a hunting-gathering system, because we're in one place doing essentially the same thing over a period of years?
Yeah.
So is building a soil in a system like that ever really attainable?
Yeah, no, that is a great question, one that I've reflected on as well. I mean, regardless, our agricultural systems are extractive. They're extractive by nature, because we are consuming either as individuals and as communities. It's not a closed system. So we are moving nutrients, we are moving product, we are moving carbon by the harvest of those materials. So yeah, can we envision ever a system that is not extractive? I'd love to have more hallway conversations on this, but I don't think we can. I think we need to look at not only our agricultural practices, but understanding the impacts of our diet, which gets extremely complex when we ask people to change what they're eating, whether it be meat or milk, and understand more about how the energy flows and the gains and losses are distributed across those systems, because there's some models that make the argument that meat and dairy production are contributing negatively to our carbon emissions, or they're emitting more carbon, more greenhouse gases. But then when you look at how important they are to these, basically mitigating these extractive systems, where are the boundaries and how do we measure that? But it's something that I've thought a lot about. What would be a system, an agricultural system that is not extractive and is truly neutral? And I have not come up with one, but be super curious to talk to you all about what that might look like.
Is our best bet just to do the least amount of damage we can?
That's what I think, at least that's the way that I'm thinking of it, is how do we know it's an extractive system, how do we try to mitigate that in terms of just how the impact we're having on their environment. But again, I think another key aspect is how, and granted, again, within the policy systems that Wendy spoke so eloquently on, how do we create a system that is going to buffer farmer risk, allow for buffering of losses, and buffering from being tied to global commodity markets, being tied towards government programs, and be independent and be able to sustain their livelihoods.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks.
With everything you've just shared in the last couple of minutes, it feels dangerous to use the word regenerative to describe any of these systems. And I would love for us as a bigger community to start really talking about that. They're less destructive, but they're not yet regenerative.
Yeah.
And there's an effort, to commoditize that word and to, carbon credits are dangerous. And the larger culture is sending this message that because it's less bad, we should be rewarding it. And the incentive is going to be to generate more credits than we're actually storing carbon. And I think we got to get a handle on this regenerative word and do a better job of defining what it means.
Yeah, and it's still to some extent the Wild West. I mean, certainly we have the Rodale program. California is coming up with a definition, but the other thing that I've seen, particularly with some of the structures of the carbon programs, which I emphasized so much at the beginning of the talk, is time. At least what I've seen from the way that industry is willing to implement these carbon programs is not giving farmers a stable price over time, but instead still only giving annual contracts because the global commodities market is so volatile. And time is key to be able to see the gains in these systems. We are not going to be able to see gains in systems over 1 year of cover cropping. We need to have some structure that industry recognizes if they truly value this, if they truly want a regenerative product, they need to be able to commit to farmers a price that's going to allow them to build the soil over time, build these systems over time, and take on that risk, because there is a risk of learning curve, and there is a risk of, at least at the start of the adoption of these practices, that there might be a blip down before you see that blip up. So there needs to be the commitment that this is a commitment of industry, a commitment of consumers, that if we expect farmers to take on this commitment, which is going to be a 10-year commitment to be able to start to see these gains, we need to have the supports in place that they can be successful in doing that. It is absolutely unrealistic to ask the farmer to take this on without creating a system that is going to be able to support them through that transition where we can see the gains. All right. Well, thank you for being patient with my filling in. I'm sorry that Jean-Michel wasn't here, but I'd love to come up and talk to you. So it was my pleasure to be able to step in. But thank you for being patient with that change. We are having our concurrent sessions in 15 minutes, so some time to transition upstairs. They start at 9:30. One talk, more related to soil health, is integrating compost for fertility and soil health, and the other one looking at cost of production tools, which I think when you're looking at adopting some of these new practices, it's really valuable and key to be able to project what that's going to mean in terms of cost of production. So again, thank you. Looking forward to a wonderful day with you all, and looking forward to talking with you more at the breaks and in the hallway. Let's have a great day and go to some great sessions for the next morning. Thank you.